Well, now, we shouldn't let facts get in the way of the narrative now, should we? Uh, Louisville is a mess right now. I the videos I saw basically of Antifa people showing up with rifles and body armor, like brand new body armor, brand new rifles too. That wasn't good to see. I did see the Louisville police making arrests earlier in the day, so maybe they actually nabbed these people ahead of time. But they had U-Haul showing up with like equipment and trucks, prefabricated sides, blockade equipment, that kind of stuff. Not a good situation in Louisville. And basically, I already saw in one of the live streams that they're starting fires and stuff. So, yeah, that's about to get really bad. Curfew, I think, is at 9 Eastern time, possibly 10. And once curfew occurs and the police start having to make arrests, or basically that's usually when the violence like major violence starts. But they're starting the night off with some fires, and I haven't seen the people who were there earlier with the body armor and all black, and they had armor and rifles, and I haven't seen those people back. So it's kind of funny. It's like when you see like the Oath Keepers or like some 2A activists show up and they got all the LARP gear and all the body armor and stuff. It's usually all these different camouflage patterns, and they're just like, yeah, government don't do stuff, and then nothing happens. They just stand out in the open and nothing happens. But when the Antifa people show up and they've got brand new armor and they're holding guns like they've never had a gun before in their life, and you just know bad stuff is about to happen. So that's Louisville. I saw they were already rioting in D.C. D.C. has a major issue because basically their mayor has effectively endorsed the lawlessness. And they basically the political tactic that the mayor is using is basically make the president look bad by forcing him to bring out federal forces, whether it's the Secret Service or the Park Police, or really like it was the one time was National Guard, federalized National Guard. Basically, he federalizes the DC National Guard, and it usually pulls resources in from other places as well. Because I think DC National Guard's not even in DC. I think they're with the Virginia Guard. I'm not sure about that. But the point is, basically force the president to send out people with tear gas and troops and make arrests, and then they can say, "Oh, our peaceful protests got crushed by the feds," and it's like, wasn't a peaceful protest, but they, the media will push that narrative, and the mayor will complain, and it's just really she ties the hands of the Capitol Police, and then historic landmarks start getting vandalized and burned down like churches and stuff, and then the DC police can't do anything about it. And then when the feds do something about it, then they get to complain, right? Whatever. But I don't think any of these people actually listened to what the Attorney General had to say about the facts of the case as they popped up. And the reason why it's not the Attorney General making the decision of essentially whether these officers are indicted or not, it's a grand jury. So they had to basically show the evidence to however many people it is, and then they had to all come to a consensus that essentially, basically, murder charges were not applicable here. And even from the facts of the case we had just first, basically the fact that we knew Walker fired first, it kind of doesn't really matter what the circumstances are that set that up, because at the point where Walker fired first, that means if the police officers return fire, that means they're really not, there's no intent there. It wasn't like they just started shooting into a house or something. One of the officers who did shoot into the apartment next door, yeah, he is being indicted for basically reckless endangerment and actually reckless use of a firearm. I don't suspect it'll be too bad for him because he was under an active firefight situation. So they will say, like, he made a mistake. It wasn't intentional, and it wasn't a criminal mistake. It just was boneheaded in the moment because when you're taking fire, things kind of. Yeah, I could totally see somebody shooting him essentially into the wrong place because while they're getting shot at. But yeah, that guy's being disciplined for that. But the other cops, it's not, they were being shot at, so it doesn't matter. But some interesting things about the case came out, which changed a lot of stuff. Let's see. Let me some quotes from the Attorney General here. The Louisville police officers involved in Breonna Taylor's shooting death knocked and announced themselves and did not execute a no-knock warrant as previously believed. Let's see. Yeah, that's... Cameron said, okay, so at the press conference, Cameron said the neighbors corroborated the police's claims that they had knocked on her apartment and announced themselves. Now, granted, here's the thing, and here's probably why this guy, basically the boyfriend, hasn't been charged. It's because they knocked essentially in the middle of the night, and the expectation of him being able to essentially hear and understand that this is a police warrant and not just people breaking into his house. Now, we don't have all the details because we know Whitaker fired first. What we don't know is if he fired at the police while they were essentially outside, basically knocking on the door. If that's the case, there may be charges to follow for the boyfriend. But that changes a lot of things because, like, somebody like me, 2A concerned, no knock warrants are an issue. But the fact these guys announced themselves, that does change things. So whether a no knock warrant may have been issued, but it was certainly not executed that way. But as we saw in the Ryan Whitaker case, just because you pound on the door and say police at 3 a.m. doesn't mean the person's going to hear or comprehend what the hell's going on, right? So it could be the cops. This could be the state's fault in general. I suspect that's why the family settled for the $12 million and not for the typical $54 million for a wrongful death. I thought that was kind of low. Seeing the facts of the case brought up here, like the fact it wasn't a no-knock warrant, I suspect that their attorney perhaps, at first I thought their attorney sucked, but I suspect that probably they said, hey, they might have a case here against the boyfriend, and if the boyfriend essentially gets arrested and indicted, they're not going to be seeing any money because it'll basically be his fault because he opened fire first. And he's the one who essentially created the dangerous situation for Taylor. I didn't realize that was the case, that they had evidence that essentially the police had knocked and had actually announced themselves. That changes things. That also changes it. That also makes it not, basically any type of murder charges just completely collapse at that point. There were some other interesting things. Let's see. Former Louisville police officer Brett Hankinson was indicted on 3 counts of wanton endangerment of the first degree for firing a service weapon blindly through a window into Taylor's building. Yeah, so that was the one, basically, yeah. Evidence showed officers knocked and announced their presence at the apartment. So, okay, so they only got the guy who basically just started shooting into the wrong spot because, that's wanton endangerment. You got to, you're responsible for where your bullets go down range. And if you're shooting into the wrong building, then yeah, that's gonna be a problem for you. 2 other officers involved with the shooting: Miles Cosgrove, So originally they were saying they couldn't determine ballistically who killed who, but according to the FBI, ballistic evidence showed it was actually Cosgrove's bullet that ultimately killed Breonna Taylor. So that changes things too, because at first they really weren't sure actually who fired the shot, because there was a chance Walker had shot and it ricocheted, or he shot at an angle or fell or something, and then that gun went off and it went through and it hit her. But they are saying no, it was actually the police officer's weapon that actually hit him. But Cosgrove's not charged because he was shot at first. He was returning fire to Walker. He had no reason. Basically, he had enough fear for his life to suspect that. Basically not, her getting killed essentially in the crossfire it's essentially, it's tragic, but if anybody's at fault, it would be Walker, because he shot first. Now you can't you can't start shooting with a crowd of people around you at a police officer, and then if the police officer returns fire and it hits somebody, police officer, they might be dumb for trying to do that if they can't get the cover, but they're not going to, that's not first degree murder. So that changes things. Our investigation found that Mattingly and Cosgrove, those are the 2 other cops, were justified in their use of force after having been fired upon by Kenneth Walker. This is something we knew ahead of time, so I don't know why people are super surprised about the verdict. I'm surprised about the details that are coming out. I'm not surprised about the verdict. They weren't going to be able to hold these cops basically for murder because they were shot at first. The decision for my office is not to decide if the loss of Breonna Taylor's life was a tragedy. Yeah, the answer to that question is unequivocally yes. All right. His case was gut-wrenching and that he encouraged a lengthy grand jury investigation so that his office could get this right. Yeah, because they are worried about basically what are the circumstances that led to essentially the situation that occurred. It's probably police protocol, because here's the thing. Yes, they may have announced themselves, which basically apparently the neighbor confirmed, But middle of the night, there's no expectation essentially that this guy could have even heard that. And second, I haven't seen anything in this contradicting that they were in plain clothes, which is another problem. And also, 3 officers to make basically a drug arrest like that. That's not enough. That's not enough guys to, like were the lights on? Like there's other things here, factors involved, and I assume they're going to. Well, I mean, he said they're going to investigate to basically figure out what led to the circumstances that allowed this to occur. Because you want to avoid firefights, period, if you can. Even if this guy here, the boyfriend Walker, ends up getting basically indicted for attempted murder for trying to shoot the cops, maybe he does, basically. Maybe he is liable for that, and they do basically say, oh, you shot at the police. Still, the fact that a firefight occurred, and it doesn't seem like the cops, or I should say, it doesn't seem like the state did everything they could to essentially avoid the violent confrontation, they're still going to want to look at that and say, okay, yes, okay, this guy was a piece of shit and shooting at the police, but because that occurred, there was crossfire and somebody innocent was killed in the crossfire who was in the building, and we had an officer who actually shot into the wrong apartment. Could this all have been avoided if there were more officers present, if there was lights, if they essentially had given this guy a better indication of he should be surrendering to police? Did they hear him? Is there an expectation of somebody hearing, basically knocking on the door, what's going on? And the Ryan Whitaker case has a little bit of similarity to this, where basically cops showed up in the middle of the night, they pound on the door, they make one announcement, Phoenix Police, and you're just expecting this dude at 3:30 in the morning to hear and understand what the hell's going on. So when he answered the door and he was armed, now granted he didn't shoot, he dropped to the ground. So like that's basically clear cut wrongful death. The cops completely screwed that up, but that's still that's, if anything, that's proof that somebody announcing themselves as police. That doesn't give somebody a reason not to answer the door armed, because then anybody could announce themselves as a police knocking on your door at 3 a.m. right? So they might need to think about these things and think about essentially like what's going on. When do you knock on someone's door at 3 a.m. because you're creating a threat situation where if it is not crystal clear to the person inside that you are police officers there lawfully, it could turn into a shootout, or it could turn into something like Ryan Whitaker's situation where all he did was show up armed and he didn't do anything threatening, but still, the one cop panicked and shot him. Could have been avoided, again, by perhaps better training, perhaps better equipment, perhaps better state action and state policies. These are things they can look at. But it's not murder. That's the thing. Like in this case, it was not going to be murder just from the fact Walker fired first. They should have known. Like they should not have been putting the expectations high for this grand jury to say that these cops are going to be indicted. They're not going to be indicted because Walker shot first. And that's the thing, is I'm seeing these people march and riot and light fires and shit, and it's like, Did anyone explain this case to them at all about like essentially why expecting essentially a murder charge is kind of ridiculous? Like, okay, maybe they think they want to hold the state responsible, right? And they want there to be justice. That's fine. That makes perfect sense to me because there's a solid argument for essentially the state put her in danger by taking the action the state did. But as for holding the officers individually responsible for murder, you can't do that. That's not going to be justice. You could lock these cops up for the rest of their life, and that wouldn't be justice because they were put in the same situation that essentially Taylor was, where their life was put in danger. They just happened to return fire, as opposed to the boyfriend who did fire. So it's really tough because basically the media, and this is why the media is called the enemy of the people. This is why they leave out the details. They just focus on the outrage and the fact that something happened, and they never explain essentially the difficult part of explaining what exactly happened with this situation that led to this tragic death. Everybody wants, when basically somebody gets killed and killed at the hand of somebody else, for it to be murder. It's not always murder. Sometimes it's an accident. Sometimes it's justified. Jacob Blake, for example, the officers. I mean, he didn't die, but the officer shooting him, that was 100% justified. But you saw the headlines were just, black man shot in front of his children 7 times in the back. And none of the context, none of the he had been basically he had assaulted a woman and he showed up and he took keys and he fought with the officers and he had been tased already and he had a knife and then he was reaching for a bigger knife in his car and that's when he was shot. Like, that all is important, not just the basic details. Because if you hear the basic details of, I should say, the basic thing of this, which is basically 3 cops showed up in the middle of the night and Breonna Taylor was shot by a police officer. And when she was on her bed, she was awake, but, she died on her bed. That sounds, oh my God, it sounds like it must be murder. Well, it's irresponsibility on part of the state. Probably, yeah, there needs to be an investigation as to essentially how this occurred. But it's not a police officer murdering somebody. And this is the other thing too, is that like there really aren't that many unarmed black people who are shot and killed by police. It's not that many. It was like 19 in 2019 and this year, I don't even know what the number is. I suspect just because the crime has basically skyrocketed, it might end up being higher. Then again, maybe it's not. Maybe cops just aren't, cops are getting killed. Somebody just walking up and just shooting people in L.A. and stuff. We've already had a number of officers assassinated this year, and that shit's been going on since 2015. And we had some state troopers ambushed. That wasn't Black Lives Matter related, but it was anti-police related. The officers do some really dangerous shit, and people don't seem to appreciate that. Far more officers are killed by armed blacks than officers kill unarmed blacks, and most of the officers who kill these people, armed or unarmed, they end up actually being black themselves because they're from the neighborhood. It's not a racial thing, and that can be proven statistically that it's not a racial thing. No, I get it that not everybody's happy with essentially how the police interact with the community at large. Okay, fine. Can have those discussions, but rioting and burning, a city down because something wasn't murder. Shouldn't they be happy that this turned out not to be a situation where it was basically like a racially motivated, hate crime that the police just showed up and shot some lady because she was black? Like, shouldn't they be happy to know, like, hey, maybe things aren't as bad? You'd think that after the body cam footage, that like the people who were screaming about George Floyd would be like, oh, this was a lot better. Like, I can feel a lot better about the police with this because I have more context to what was occurring. Because all of us seeing just that basically that final 7 minutes clip, that looked really bad. But if you see all the context leading up to it, you go, oh, okay, I understand what happened here. For instance, it clears the other 3 officers completely. And Chauvin, basically, he took extra precaution for Floyd's well-being, except for essentially a misjudgment about possibly how much pressure he was putting on the neck when he was holding the guy. And then on top of that, when they find the autopsy that essentially he died of effectively a fentanyl overdose, and while the knee that he was putting, they're still not sure how much pressure that could have contributed to it. That ultimately isn't what stopped his heart. Because that was the thing. I was worried that because basically when they initially said, okay, basically he had a heart attack, and from the video and from essentially what happened, it seemed like he had a heart attack because he's saying I can't breathe, which means he can breathe, but that doesn't mean that it might feel like you can't breathe because essentially you're getting your blood flow cut off. What else? It's how people die getting choked out. It's usually not the lack of oxygen it gets them. It's usually they cut the blood off. And that's what I was afraid of, was essentially that he had put basically pressure down on the neck, and he was being inconsiderate, and he put enough pressure for enough time where Floyd had a heart attack. But now seeing the context of the fact that essentially he had enough fentanyl in his system to cause the heart attack, it calls into question how much pressure was put on the neck by the officer despite what it looked like. Because Floyd kept raising up, right? He kept raising his neck up. And at first you go, okay, well, it's because he's struggling, because he's saying he can't breathe and he's trying to get out. But then you also realize he was jittering and he was having problems before that, and he was actually asked to be put on the ground. So that may have been unrelated. Probably the officer made a bad call in that case. He definitely shouldn't put basically the knee on the neck in that situation. If you're going to hold somebody in the neck, you have to pretty much have to use your palm, and you have to hold that way, because that's really the only way to guarantee you're not hurting the person. If it's war or whatever, grab them, do whatever you got to do. If it's a guy who had just been shooting at you, yeah, go ahead, put it on the neck while you're cuffing the person. But in that case, Probably that wasn't a good choice. But now we know. At least we know it's like there's not really evidence of it being homicide, or I should say being murder. Homicide, yes, but because homicide is just basically somebody killed at the hands of somebody else. But as for it being premeditated murder, it's not. That's a good sign. Maybe that means that, or just say it should mean that essentially maybe basically the cops are not as racist as they thought. Maybe they're not as careless as we thought. It made the other officers look perfectly fine. The one of them who got arrested, they're out on bail now. He was literally guarding a police car. He wasn't involved at all with the physical handling of Floyd. And his life's upside down too, and he's not working. He was a perfectly fine cop. The other two cops, perfectly fine. And Chauvin, now we have to look and basically determine, was it irresponsibility that he did this? Was it carelessness? Was it reckless disregard? Or was he trained to basically do it this way? And maybe he wasn't actually putting as much pressure as we kind of thought. Floyd was able to move. We did see that. That does tell some things, that essentially he wasn't trying to completely pressure him into the ground. I thought it was basically reckless endangerment. It was manslaughter. Finding out after the autopsy and seeing essentially the fact that Chauvin didn't seem to not have, basically he had plenty of opportunities beforehand to show disregard for Floyd's safety, and he didn't. That goes against that. And it's like, if you can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, you can't really convict somebody. Let's see. A couple more quotes from Cameron. I certainly understand the pain this has brought about the tragic loss of Miss Taylor. I understand that as an attorney general who was responsible for 120 counties, in terms of being the chief legal officer, the chief law enforcement officer, I understand that. I understand that as a black man, how powerful this is, which is why it is so incredibly important to make sure that we did everything we possibly could to uncover every fact. That's again, it's like Cameron here is making the judgment off the facts. He's not saying, I'm black, I got to pick the black team. He's making a judgment based on the facts. It's like John Adams when he defended the basically the redcoats from the Boston Massacre. It was basically like, yeah, okay, he's a patriot. He's a rebel. He rebelled against these people, right? And he still said, justice has to be done. The facts matter in this case. We can't just say they're redcoats, we can hang them just because it's us versus them. There has to be basically justice and accountability. And that's exactly what Cameron's living up to here. And it makes me happy to know that somebody like Cameron is there setting the example for essentially you can be black or you can be white, and you don't have to play team politics. You can just look at the facts and you can try to make it basically a judgment based on that, not based on essentially the emotions, not based on how this case makes you feel. Basically based on just essentially what does this case mean? Like what are the actual facts of the case? Let's see. I understand that Miss Breonna Taylor's death has become a part of a national story in conversation. We must also remember that facts and the collection of evidence in this case are different than cases elsewhere in the country. Each is unique and cannot be compared. Yeah, that's fair. In some cases, you can essentially, like for instance, the Ryan Whitaker case and this case, you can compare essentially. Late at night, they knock on the door. But that's as far as you can go, and basically to ascribe essentially racial homicide murders or racial murder motive to every police officer who's involved with a situation like this just is not fair. It's not fair. It's not factual. That causes people to get paranoid. White supremacists are everywhere. It's like they see police officers and they assume it's like a gang stalking thing. Like we're just like, oh my god, the cops are just out to get you because of your race. We know that's not what's going on. And this is just further essentially evidence of that. These people should be relieved that things are not as bad as essentially the agitators are telling them it is. But they want to be mad. It's tough to get through to somebody who's upset. And it's like, I don't know what else to do. It's like, I'm making my video here. I mean, hopefully somebody will see it and be like, oh, okay, maybe I should approach this from a more reasonable standpoint. Look, the thing is like, it's kind of like when George Floyd died in police custody. Nobody's happy with that. And the state, because he died in his custody, yeah, or should he died in their custody. Well, there's things to consider there. Like, the fact he had a fentanyl overdose, and they were, they knew he was on drugs, and they didn't have the stuff they needed to essentially counteract that. They weren't able to figure out, basically, they weren't able to figure out the best way to save his life. Because even if he had cooperated and stayed in the car, because he was freaking out because of that, he would have died on the way to the hospital or wherever they were taking him, due to the amount of fentanyl that was in him. And the state, once somebody's showing up as, and essentially they've put somebody in custody, we should figure out what the tools and the training is needed to at least keep those people alive, particularly for fentanyl overdoses. We're dealing with that all over the country, right? So it's a tragedy. This case, Breonna Taylor gets killed essentially in the crossfire of a firefight that starts in the AM. Yeah, you should probably, reassess essentially your approach. Because even if the cops had the full right to be there, maybe let's pretend some of the facts were changed, and we find out the cops were uniformed, and the cops knocked, and the cops had their lights on, and they took fire, right? You still got to look back and be like, well, somebody innocent was killed in this crossfire, and it wasn't even a hostage situation. It's just that somebody was innocent was killed in the crossfire. That's not acceptable. It might happen, but see, that was news flash or something about Louisville. But like, these are discussions we can have, but you can't have the discussion when people are rioting and people don't even agree on the basically facts. They won't even listen to what Cameron said, and if they did hear what Cameron said, they just assume he's lying because why is he lying? Is he a secret white supremacist? I saw Cameron. He's like, he's black as anybody else is. Like, he's not a white supremacist, right? He's got no reason to lie. But, people don't want to listen. They want to believe that there's problems. Let's see. Last thing he said, our reaction to the truth is the society we want to be. Cameron continued. Do we really want the truth, or do we want the truth that fits our narrative? Do we want the facts? Are we content to blindly accept our own vision of events? We as a community must make that decision. That's a tough pill to swallow, and he is 100% correct. Because I got news for you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the truth is if people are basically getting violent in response. They're going to be smashed down on. It doesn't matter whether they think that they're righteous or not. You can't allow that violence to continue because the truth is more important than your grander perception. So, but to a certain degree, it doesn't matter what the truth is if somebody's out there violently doing stuff, because if they're gonna do that anyway, it makes it really tough. It makes the whole situation non-negotiable. He continued. There will be celebrities, influencers, and activists who have never lived in Kentucky will try to tell us how to feel, suggesting they understood the facts of the case, that they know our communities and the Commonwealth better than we do. He concluded they don't. Well, I'm starting to think by seeing the reaction on the ground that essentially nobody even listened to the facts or what this came out. Now, there was some talk about essentially, should the grand jury information be released? The problem is with the grand jury is that those people under this circumstance, they're in danger. There's a reason why the jury is secret in this grand jury case. I'm not big into grand juries, or to say the privateness of it, but I do understand the argument for basically keeping essentially them secret. Are we able to bring up basically the information, more facts about the case, more of a layout, even just a video presentation or something saying like, okay, this is what happened, timeline, piece by piece by piece, all the way back to essentially when the warrant is being issued. Now, here's the thing. They're saying it was a lawful drug arrest warrant. That's different than what we were initially told, which we were initially told that essentially the cops were in the wrong place. So, did they actually have a warrant for Walker, or did they have a warrant lawfully for that place and the person they were looking for not there? Again, that's part of an ongoing investigation, so they didn't release the information for that. But we do know essentially the officers were there lawfully, and they returned fire. People should be happy that essentially this wasn't, an assassination by the state. I'm certainly happy that at least the cops are aware that a no-knock warrant's a bad idea, so they did at least try to announce themselves. I guess really that settlement kind of gave things away, that it was a $12 million settlement instead of $54 million, that there was more to this case than we thought. But we also knew just from the facts they had given us, I should say facts because things keep changing, right? Because the fact originally was it was a no-knock warrant. Now it's not. But that, that Walker shot first. Like Walker said, he shot first. So, like, the cops were not going to be held responsible, or I should say, they're not going to be held for murder because they were returning fire. I mean, sometimes it's dumb. Like, there was that dude in, there's a shooting in New York City a little while ago. I think somebody shot at the police officers and missed, and then the cop returned fire, and like 3 people in the crowd were hit. Nobody died, but you're like, oh god. So it's not like this is a one size fits all thing, but in this case, we should know. So I hope Cameron is front and center on this. When I saw him talk originally, I only actually caught a piece of it. I was reading, obviously, reading part of the transcript. He seems like a totally reasonable guy, and and I'm also thanking God that like he is a black dude, because if he wasn't, they would be saying, like oh, this is some Klan person lying, because if you're white, apparently you're associated with the Klan, even if you're Catholic, right? They would just say something like that. This guy, it's a lot harder to impugn his credibility, because he matches essentially. He should be on our team, right? Because he's black. Well, he's on the team of the truth. That's what we want. That's the kind of man we want, and that's the kind of law enforcement officer we want. So hopefully we'll be able to get down to the bottom, essentially, of what all the procedural problems that led to this are. And we also, that's the other thing, we got to figure out what's going on with this drug investigation. Is going to have to conclude too, so that we can get all the information to find out, because it's possible Walker or someone who had been staying at the property was a target, and basically he fully knew the police were coming, and maybe he shot at them because he shot at them. We don't know. We don't know what this is, all right? Because that part of the investigation is still going on. But we can rest assured that basically Taylor was not murdered, right? Should be happy, but nope. They're going to burn the place down. I guess I'll check in tomorrow and find out the kind of damage. I'm actually a little more worried about D.C. than I am about Louisville. D.C. things can escalate a lot. There's a lot more like landmarks and problems and things, stuff can, shoot, basically, if there's an insurrection in the Capitol, there's a problem. There's an insurrection in Louisville, and we can deal with that. DC, it seems like Louisville's mayor seems to, he at least had the cops out. They had the body armor and stuff. Antifa was showing up with rifles and armor and stuff. So, but they at least seem like they're trying to do it. The fact they were making arrests earlier in the day, that's a huge plus. That's a huge sign that things are going in the right direction. DC, it looks like they just kind of all showed up at once the sun went down. And I didn't see any evidence of essentially the DC mayor changing her mind and actually arresting people ahead of time who were the agitators. So I got a feeling this is something just the feds are going to deal with directly. Their whole goal is basically to get the president back in the bunker so that they can say, oh, he's cowering to the protesters. And it's like, well, you guys are, a violent mob. I wonder, he did have an emergency phone call earlier. I wonder what that was for. That could have been anything, right? See, that's the thing people should be talking about. But instead, it's, this stupid case that, we all should be on the same page about. Nobody's happy she died, but there's no, okay, it wasn't a murder. Good. Louisville police aren't complete assholes. That should be a good thing, right? But They gotta have that enemy because they gotta justify how angry they are. You ain't gonna get anywhere doing that. I mean, I should say, you're only going to destroy things doing that. So, don't spread crap online. Don't be sharing, like, because the headlines are usually what they do. The headline will say, like, "Oh, police officer not indicted for fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor," or like they'll say, like, people outraged at this, like that'll be the headline, and instead of like actually like, well, they came out and turns out essentially what they did was lawful, and like the lead thing, let's say, yeah, like, so let's say Daily Wire's got this article up, and within basically the first paragraph is essentially setting the stage, and the second paragraph says basically the most important information, which was a shootout where Kenneth Walker shot first, and that was basically the justification of force. Right there, essentially that has set the context of what's going on. Other articles, they don't do that. They bury the information all the way at the bottom. The Atlantic, Vox, or if they even say it, right? Sometimes the article is just about how outraged you should be, and then doesn't even explain the context. So, yeah. But whatever. I hope. I pray for the safety of the cops out there tonight. And for the people who just don't know any better. I mean, there's plenty of just angry people out there who are just ignorant. Maybe they don't mean any harm. But, they should realize they're the bodies that are providing cover for the insurrectionists. That's why, that's what they're out there for. And you're expendable. If you're marching and you're just raising your fist and you're not the one starting fires and throwing bricks or shooting, you're expendable. You're essentially a meat cushion for basically the beanbag rounds and for the live ammo, because that you're being used as cover. So don't be mad at the cops. Just go home. Just go home. If shit gets violent, just go home. Don't be stupid. Go home. Because if you stay out past the curfew, if people around you are being violent and throwing stuff, and then you don't get the hell out of there, if you get hurt, I'm just going to shrug my shoulders, because it's like you really need to not be there. You really need to bug out once the stuff gets out of hand, because the cops are not going to start the fight. All right, it's basically, if you stay out there past curfew, they might try to arrest you, and if you start fighting and then you get hit with a nightstick, it's like, well, what did you expect? It's whatever the curfew is, whether it was 9 or 10, and then look, if you find yourself caught in the middle and you're not able to get back, just say, hey, walk with hands up and be like, hey, look, I'm trying to leave. I know the curfew's on. I'm trying to leave. There's ways to avoid getting hurt. Just because you're angry doesn't mean, that these cops aren't going to essentially fight back if people are throwing Molotovs at them, and bricks and stuff. You're not immune to getting hurt just because you think you're nonviolent. And just because your cause is righteous doesn't mean you're immune to getting hurt. Get the hell out of there. You see 85 people showing with body armor and guns? Yeah. Okay, do your march in the early evening, then go home, because they're going to start trouble. It's to a certain point, it's your responsibility for your own safety. It's, again, if you get hit, if you get shot, if something happens, I'm just kind of going to shrug my shoulder and be like, well, what'd you guys expect? You knew what was going on out here. You knew basically the BLM radical types and the Antifa types were there to start trouble. And if you get hurt because you're another body in the crowd that they're using as a shield, well, you chose to be there. So, live another day and then protest another day. If you don't live the day, then great, you protested once and now you're a corpse, or you're in a wheelchair, or you broke your arm or something. Like that sucks. Don't be that person. You can avoid being that person, even if you're completely ignorant of Cameron and the facts of the case, and you think this was like some sort of murder. You still can avoid getting hurt by going home when the fighting starts. So, yeah, kind of a long one tonight, but I just wanted to at least show some appreciation for Attorney General Daniel Cameron, because yeah, I mean, he's in a tough position, and But he's going for he's siding with the truth. He's not being an activist, and that's exactly what we want out of our AGs and DAs. So good for him. I hope we see more of them.